Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where going to bed wasn't just lying down and closing your eyes. We're talking about medieval castles, where noble families turned bedtime into an elaborate ceremony filled with superstition, fear, and rituals that would seem absolutely bizarre to us today. This isn't about romance or fairy tales. This is about the strange, uncomfortable, and often terrifying reality of trying to sleep in a cold stone fortress where the night belonged to something other than rest. If this kind of slow, detailed history helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there falling asleep to the same quiet stories from the past. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on that fan for some background noise, and let's begin our journey into the peculiar world of medieval bedtime. Sunset. When the castle transforms, the moment the sun began its descent below the hills, everything changed. The medieval castle wasn't just a home. It was a fortress, and as daylight faded, it transformed into something that felt more like a prison than a palace. The castle gates didn't simply close. They sealed. Heavy oak doors, reinforced with iron bands, swung shut with a finality that echoed through the stone corridors. You could hear the grinding of chains as the portcullis, that massive iron grate, descended from above, its pointed ends driving into grooves carved into the stone floor. Once it was down, that was it. No one came in. No one went out. Guards took their positions along the walls and at key points throughout the castle. But they weren't just watching for external threats. They were watching everyone. Because in a medieval castle at night, trust was a luxury few could afford. The steward, that powerful figure who managed the household, made his rounds, checking that every door was bolted, every shutter fastened, every potential weakness secured. He carried a ring of keys that jangled with each step, a sound that became synonymous with the approaching night. The household servants moved with practiced efficiency through their final tasks of the day. Torches were lit in wall sconces, casting flickering shadows that danced across the tapestries. These weren't just for decoration. The thick woven hangings served a practical purpose, creating an additional layer between the stone walls and the living spaces, helping to keep out the brutal cold and the drafts that whistled through every crack and crevice. As darkness deepened, the castle's dogs were released from their daytime restraints. These weren't pampered pets. They were working animals, bred for protection and trained to be suspicious of anyone moving through the corridors after dark. Their presence added another layer of security, but it also added an element of danger. More than one sleepwalking family member had been bitten by their own hounds, mistaken for an intruder in the darkness. The evening bell tolled from the castle chapel, a sound that carried through every room and corridor. This wasn't just a time marker. It was a warning. After the bell, movement was restricted. Anyone found wandering the halls needed a very good reason, and preferably a torch and an escort. The darkness in a medieval castle wasn't like the darkness we experience today. When the shutters were closed and the torches burned low, it was absolute. The kind of darkness that felt thick, almost tangible. The kind that made even the bravest night uneasy. Noble families retreated to their private chambers as the castle locked down for the night. These chambers were located in the most secure parts of the castle, often in the keep itself, that central tower that served as the last line of defense. The location was strategic. If the outer walls were breached, if enemies somehow made it past the gates, the family could retreat upward, sealing themselves in until help arrived or until they could negotiate. But the threats nobles feared at night weren't always external. Within these stone walls lived ambition, jealousy, and desperation. Family members competed for inheritance. Servants harbored grudges. Political alliances shifted like sand. The night, when everyone was vulnerable, when doors were closed and guards might grow drowsy, was when danger felt most immediate. This wasn't paranoia. It was reality. History is filled with accounts of nobles who died suspiciously in their sleep, of heirs who disappeared during the night, of servants who were blamed for crimes that may have been committed by someone wearing silk instead of homespun. So when the sun set on a medieval castle, it didn't just bring darkness. It brought a transformation. The castle sealed itself, creating a world within walls, where every sound echoed with potential threat, where every shadow might hide something watching, waiting. And this was the world in which noble families prepared for sleep. The evening meal. Food is protection. Before anyone could think about sleep, there was the evening meal. But this wasn't dinner as we understand it. The medieval evening meal, taken after sunset, served multiple purposes. Yes, it provided nourishment, but it also functioned as a ritual of protection, a social gathering that reinforced hierarchy, and a final act of communion before the household separated into the dangerous privacy of individual chambers. The Great Hall, during the day a place of noise and activity, took on a different character in the evening. Torches and candles provided the only light, creating pools of warm glow surrounded by deep shadows. The high table, positioned on a raised platform, was where the lord and lady of the castle sat, flanked by their most important family members and honored guests. Everyone else arranged themselves at lower tables, according to a strict hierarchy that everyone understood instinctively. Your distance from the high table wasn't just about seating. It was about your value, your status, your place in the world. The food itself followed particular rules for the evening meal. The medieval understanding of health was based on the theory of humors, the belief that the body contained 4 essential fluids that needed to be kept in balance: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Different foods were thought to affect these humors in different ways. What you ate before sleep was considered crucial because sleep itself was seen as a vulnerable state, a time when the humors could become imbalanced, when the body was open to invasion by illness or worse. Heavy, grounding foods were preferred for the evening. Thick pottage, a porridge-like dish made from grains and vegetables, formed the base of most meals. Unlike the midday dinner, which might include roasted meats and elaborate dishes, the evening meal was deliberately designed to weigh down the spirit, to anchor the soul to the body during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The theory was that lighter foods, particularly anything with strong spices or unusual properties, could cause the soul to become too active, potentially allowing it to wander during sleep or making the sleeper vulnerable to nightmares and demonic visitation. Bread served at the evening meal was often day-old, dense, and heavy. The nobility, who could afford wheat bread, still preferred it slightly stale for the evening. The act of chewing the tough bread was almost meditative, slowing down the meal, preparing the body and mind for rest. Wine was diluted more heavily in the evening than during the day. Strong drink before sleep was thought to heat the blood excessively, leading to disturbing dreams and restless sleep. Certain foods were specifically avoided after dark. Mushrooms were considered far too unpredictable, their properties too aligned with the fairy realm and the other world. Anything fermented beyond wine or the weakest ale was suspect. Fresh fruits, particularly those that grew close to the ground, were thought to carry too much of the earth's cold dampness, potentially chilling the sleeper's vital heat. But perhaps most important were the protective additions to the meal. Salt was sprinkled not just for flavor, but as a barrier against evil. A pinch of salt consumed before sleep was thought to create a protective barrier within the body itself. Certain herbs, particularly rosemary, were added to dishes not primarily for taste, but for their protective qualities. Rosemary was associated with memory and clarity, thought to help the sleeper maintain their sense of self even in the vulnerable state of unconsciousness. The meal proceeded with formal grace. Prayers were said not just before eating, but between courses. These weren't simple blessings. They were petitions for protection through the coming night. The chaplain, if the household was wealthy enough to employ one, might circulate among the tables, offering individual blessings to those who seemed anxious or unwell. Conversation during the evening meal followed unwritten rules. Certain topics were avoided. Death, illness, and bad omens were not discussed after sunset. To speak of darkness was thought to invite it closer. Instead, the talk centered on practical matters resolved during the day, on pleasant memories, on plans for the following morning. The idea was to enter sleep with the mind at peace, not agitated by worry or fear. For children, the evening meal was particularly ritualized. They ate separately from the adults in the nursery or under the watchful eye of nurses and tutors. Their food was even more carefully controlled. Nothing too rich, nothing too exciting. Warm milk with honey if the household could afford it. Soft bread, bland pottage. The goal was to make them drowsy, to ease their transition into sleep without stimulating their imaginations. Servants ate last, often in the kitchen or in a separate hall. Their meal consisted of whatever remained after the nobles had finished, supplemented by the coarser bread and weaker ale allocated for their use. But they followed the same basic principles. Heavy foods, blessed and protected, consumed with the understanding that the night ahead held its own dangers. The meal ended with a final cup of wine, heavily spiced and warmed. This wasn't for pleasure. It was medicinal, a last defense against the cold and the dark. Each person drank from their own cup, carefully watched by those around them. Poison was rare, but not unknown. And the evening meal, when everyone's guard might be lowered by fatigue, was seen as a particularly vulnerable time. When the meal concluded, the household dispersed, but they didn't rush. The transition from the communal warmth of the hall to the isolation of individual chambers was done gradually, deliberately. To move too quickly was thought to jar the spirit, to create an imbalance that would lead to poor sleep. So they lingered, talking quietly, allowing the food to settle, allowing their eyes to adjust to the dimming light as candles burned low. The great hall, so full of life and warmth during the meal, emptied slowly. Servants cleared the tables, moving quietly, speaking in whispers. The dogs settled in their favorite spots near the dying fires. And one by one, the noble family retreated to their chambers, carrying with them the protection of the evening meal. Their bodies filled with grounding food, their spirits anchored, ready or at least as ready as they could be for the journey into sleep. Preparing the chamber. The servant's secret work. The bedchamber of a noble wasn't just cleaned and arranged. It was prepared through an elaborate ritual that most nobles never fully witnessed. By the time they entered their sleeping quarters, an army of servants had already performed dozens of small acts designed to make the room not just comfortable, but protected. The chamber itself was typically located in the keep, in one of the more secure areas of the castle. Size varied tremendously depending on wealth and status. A powerful lord might have a chamber large enough to hold a massive bed, several chests, chairs, and even a small table. Lesser nobles made do with smaller spaces, sometimes barely larger than the bed itself. But regardless of size, the preparation followed similar patterns. The first task was airing. During the day, windows, really just narrow slits in the stone, were open to allow fresh air to circulate. But as evening approached, these were sealed. Not with glass, which was expensive and rare, but with wooden shutters, often backed with oilcloth or even thin sheets of horn, that allowed some light through while keeping out the worst of the cold. The shutters were checked carefully for cracks or gaps. Any opening, no matter how small, was thought to provide entry not just for cold air but for malevolent spirits. The floor, usually made of wood planks laid over the stone, was covered with rushes, layers of dried grasses and herbs that provided insulation and absorbed moisture. These weren't just scattered randomly. They were laid in patterns, changed regularly, and mixed with specific herbs. Lavender, chamomile, and rue were common choices. The lavender for its calming scent, the chamomile for promoting rest, the rue for protection against evil influences. The hearth was crucial. Most noble chambers had their own fireplace, a luxury that set them apart from the servants who slept in shared, unheated spaces. But managing the fire was a delicate balance. It needed to be large enough to heat the cold stone room, but not so large that it posed a fire risk through the night. The wood was carefully selected: oak for steady, long-burning heat, apple wood for its pleasant scent, rowan, when available, for its protective properties against witchcraft and evil spirits. The fire was built in the late afternoon and tended carefully until the noble retired. Then it was banked, the logs arranged to burn slowly through the night without flaring up dangerously. A metal screen, if the household possessed one, was placed in front to contain any sparks. The room was never allowed to go completely cold, but neither could the fire be left to burn freely. More than one castle fire had started from an untended bedchamber hearth. The bed itself required the most elaborate preparation. Medieval beds for the nobility were substantial pieces of furniture, often the most valuable item a family owned. The frame was made of wood, usually oak, carved and sometimes painted. Ropes were strung across the frame in a lattice pattern, creating the support for the mattress. These ropes had to be tightened regularly. The phrase, "sleep tight," actually comes from this practice. Loose ropes meant a sagging, uncomfortable mattress. On top of the rope frame went the first mattress, usually stuffed with straw or sometimes wool. This provided the basic cushioning and insulation from the ropes below. On top of this went a second mattress, stuffed with feathers if the family could afford it. Goose feathers were most common, but the wealthiest might have mattresses stuffed with down, the soft under feathers that provided superior warmth and comfort. Sheets, when they existed, were made of linen. These were expensive items, carefully maintained and treated as valuable household goods. They were changed regularly, but what regularly meant depended on the household's wealth and the availability of clean linen. Before the noble entered, the sheets were checked for any signs of wear, any tears or thin spots that might need mending. On top of the sheets went the coverlet, a heavy covering that might be wool, fur, or in the wealthiest households, silk lined with fur. Multiple layers were common because medieval rooms, even with a fire, were cold. The cold seeped up from the stone floors, radiated from the stone walls, and crept in through every tiny gap in the shutters. But physical comfort was only part of the preparation. Protection was equally important. Small sachets, little bags made of cloth and filled with herbs and other substances, were placed at strategic points around the chamber. One at each corner of the bed was standard. The contents varied, but common ingredients included lavender and rosemary for calming and clarity, vervain, thought to protect against witchcraft, salt, the universal protective substance, sometimes small religious relics, a scrap of blessed cloth, a tiny vial of holy water. In some households, small pieces of iron, believed to repel fairy folk and evil spirits. These sachets weren't just tossed under the pillow. They were positioned deliberately, creating a protective boundary around the sleeping space. Some families had the sachets blessed by the household chaplain or visiting priest, adding religious authority to the herbal protection. The area beneath the bed received special attention. This dark space was considered particularly vulnerable to spiritual intrusion. Some households placed iron objects under the bed. Others sprinkled salt in a line beneath it. Servants checked this space carefully, not just for physical threats like mice or rats, but for any signs of tampering, any objects that shouldn't be there. Candles were positioned around the room, ready to be lit when the noble retired. These weren't just for light. Beeswax candles, expensive but preferred, were thought to purify the air. The number of candles reflected both wealth and concern. Some households burned a single candle, carefully rationed. Others lit several, creating a warm glow that pushed back the darkness. The chamber pot, that necessary item, was placed discreetly, usually in a corner or behind a screen if one existed. It was freshly cleaned and sometimes scented with herbs to minimize unpleasantness. The location was chosen carefully. It couldn't be too close to the bed for obvious reasons, but it couldn't be too far either. Stumbling across a dark room in the middle of the night was dangerous, and nobles had injured themselves in such attempts. Water for washing was provided in a basin, usually placed on a small stand. But at night, This water might be specially prepared. Some households added rose petals or lavender to the water. Others had it blessed. The act of washing hands and face before sleep was considered both practical and spiritual, removing the dirt and concerns of the day. The clothing the noble would wear to bed was laid out carefully. These weren't the elaborate garments worn during the day, but specially designed sleep clothes. For men, this might be a long linen shirt or a wool robe. For women, a linen shift covered by a heavier nightgown. These garments were checked for cleanliness, for any tears or damage, and most importantly, for any signs of tampering. Clothing poisoning, where toxic substances were worked into the fabric, was rare but known. Perhaps most intriguingly, some households employed small dogs as part of the bedchamber preparation. These weren't pets in the modern sense. They were bed warmers and flea magnets. The theory was that fleas, those ubiquitous medieval pests, would prefer the dog to the human. So a small dog might be placed in the bed an hour before the noble retired, warming the sheets and hopefully attracting any fleas in the bedding. The dog was then removed, taking the fleas with it, at least in theory. It's worth noting that while castle tour guides sometimes claim medieval people slept sitting up to avoid the death position of lying flat, this appears to be more folklore than historical fact. Medieval artwork predominantly shows people sleeping lying down, and the short beds sometimes found in historic sites were likely later constructions from the 16th and 17th centuries, or the result of sagging rope supports rather than deliberate design for upright sleeping. All of this preparation happened while the noble was elsewhere, usually at the evening meal. When they finally entered their chamber, everything was ready. The fire glowed warmly. The bed was turned down, revealing clean sheets and plump pillows. Candles flickered in their holders. The air smelled of herbs and wood smoke. The room appeared peaceful, safe, comfortable. But beneath this apparent comfort lay layers of ritual and superstition. Every herb, every sachet, every positioned object was part of an elaborate system of protection. The servants who prepared the chamber knew this. They might not understand all the reasons, but they knew the consequences of neglect. A poorly prepared chamber meant poor sleep, and poor sleep might mean illness, nightmares, or worse. The relationship between the noble and the servant who prepared their chamber was built on absolute trust. This person saw everything. They knew how well the noble slept, what disturbed their rest, their private habits and concerns. In many households, the same servant prepared the chamber for years, learning the particular preferences and superstitions of their master or mistress. And there was power in this knowledge. A servant who prepared the chamber could, if they chose, alter that preparation. A different herb in the sachet, a misplaced object, a draft allowed through an insufficiently sealed shutter. Most servants were loyal, bound to their household by tradition and mutual obligation. But not all, and the nobles knew this. So they watched, they checked, they maintained their own small rituals to verify that the preparation was correct. This created a strange dynamic. The noble depended utterly on servants for basic comfort and protection, but they couldn't fully trust anyone. So they developed their own checking rituals, inspecting the bed, sniffing the sachets, testing the security of the shutters, all while pretending to take it all for granted. The bed itself, architecture of sleep. The bed where a medieval noble slept was nothing like our modern mattresses. It was a piece of architecture, a statement of wealth and status, and a carefully designed refuge from the cold and dark. Understanding the bed itself helps us understand why bedtime was such an elaborate ritual. The foundation of any noble bed was the frame. This was built from solid wood, usually oak, chosen for its strength and durability. The frame had to be sturdy because everything else built upon it was heavy. The posts at each corner rose high above the mattress level, sometimes reaching 8 or 10 feet into the air. These posts weren't just structural. They were often carved with intricate designs, painted, or even gilded if the family was wealthy enough. Across the top of these posts ran horizontal beams, creating a framework for the most distinctive feature of a noble bed, the canopy. This wasn't just decoration. The canopy served multiple crucial functions. First, it created a room within a room, a small enclosed space that could be heated more easily than the whole chamber. The fabric of the canopy trapped the sleeper's body heat, creating a relatively warm cocoon even when the rest of the chamber was freezing. The canopy fabric was chosen carefully. Wool was common, sometimes lined with linen for those who could afford it. The wealthiest nobles might have silk canopies, often imported at great expense. But whatever the material, it needed to be thick enough to trap heat and block drafts. Many canopies were lined with fur for extra warmth and luxury. Hanging from the canopy frame were curtains, heavy drapes that could be drawn closed on all sides. These curtains created privacy in a world where privacy was rare. Remember that many nobles had servants sleeping in the same chamber, positioned on pallets on the floor or on smaller beds. The curtains allowed the noble couple to have at least visual privacy, even if sound still carried. But the curtains served another purpose that medieval nobles took very seriously. They created a barrier against the spiritual dangers of the night. Evil spirits, demons, even the devil himself were thought to prowl through chambers during the dark hours. The enclosed bed, curtains drawn tight, was like a fortress within a fortress. Some canopies had religious symbols embroidered into them. Crosses, saints, protective prayers worked into the fabric itself. The rope lattice that supported the mattresses was a constant source of concern and maintenance. The ropes were usually made from hemp or similar strong fibers, woven in a crosshatch pattern. Over time, they stretched and sagged, requiring regular tightening. This was done with a specialized tool, a bed wrench, used to twist and tighten the ropes. The sagging of bed ropes was such a common problem that it entered the language. When we say sleep tight, we're actually referring to this medieval practice of tightening bed ropes. The mattresses themselves were layered affairs. The bottom mattress, lying directly on the ropes, was typically stuffed with straw. This was the cheapest filling and provided basic cushioning, but straw had problems. It compacted over time, becoming lumpy and uncomfortable. It provided homes for various insects and vermin, and it needed to be replaced regularly, usually at least once a year. Some households added a layer of wool batting on top of the straw mattress, providing additional cushioning and warmth. Then came the prized feather mattress. Goose feathers were most common for nobility, carefully collected, cleaned, and stuffed into a thick linen casing. A good feather mattress was a valuable possession, often mentioned specifically in wills and inheritance documents. The quality of feathers mattered enormously. Down, the soft underfeathers, was most prized for its combination of softness and warmth. But down was expensive, and most feather mattresses mixed down with regular feathers. The ratio of down to regular feathers was a mark of wealth. A mattress of pure down was a luxury few could afford. On top of the mattresses came the sheets. Linen was the standard material because it was smooth, relatively easy to clean, and became softer with repeated washing. The sheets were large, often large enough to tuck under the mattress and fold over the top coverlet. This tucking wasn't just for neatness. It created an envelope of fabric that helped trap body heat. Pillows followed a similar pattern to mattresses. A cheaper pillow might be stuffed with feathers or even wool. The finest pillows used down. But medieval pillows weren't soft, fluffy things like modern pillows. They were flatter, firmer, designed to support the head without being too soft. The medieval understanding of healthy sleep involved keeping the head elevated to allow evil humors to drain downward during the night. The number of pillows was another status marker. A single pillow was standard. 2 pillows suggested comfort and wealth. 3 or more was ostentatious, showing off. Some nobles, particularly those suffering from respiratory issues, did use multiple pillows to sleep in a more upright position for genuine medical reasons. The coverlet, the top layer, was the most visible marker of wealth. This might be wool, either plain or elaborately embroidered. Fur-lined coverlets were common among the wealthy, with the fur side worn against the body for warmth. The outer side might be wool or even silk, often in colors that indicated the family's status. Rich reds, deep blues, and purples were particularly prized because the dyes were expensive. Some coverlets were enormous, heavy enough to provide serious weight on top of the sleeper. This wasn't uncomfortable. The weight was considered beneficial, pressing down gently, creating a sense of security and helping to trap body heat close to the body. The warming pan was an essential accessory for the bed. This was a metal pan, usually brass or copper, with a long handle. Hot coals from the hearth were placed in the pan, and it was run between the sheets before the noble got into bed. This warmed the sheets and drove out any dampness. The warming pan had to be used carefully. Too hot, and it could scorch the sheets or, worse, start a fire. Many households had strict rules about who could operate the warming pan and how it was to be used. Some households also used heated stones or bricks, wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. These retained heat longer than coals in a warming pan and were safer, though less effective at warming the entire bed. The space under the bed wasn't empty. This was where chamber pots were sometimes stored during the day. It was also where additional bedding might be kept, or where a servant's pallet would be placed. But the space under the bed was also considered spiritually significant. Darkness beneath the bed was seen as a potential entry point for evil influences. So some families placed protective objects there: iron bars, salt, religious items. The entire bed, with all its components, represented a massive investment. A fully appointed bed with good mattresses, fine linens, fur coverlets, and elaborate hangings might be worth more than everything else in the chamber combined. Beds were so valuable that they were often mentioned in wills, passed down through generations and sometimes stolen during raids or warfare. The bed wasn't just where you slept. It was where important conversations happened, where births occurred, where people died. The deathbed had particular significance. Many medieval illustrations show nobles conducting business from their beds, receiving visitors while propped up against pillows. The bed was a stage, a throne, a fortress. And when night fell, when the noble finally climbed into this elaborate construction, pulling the heavy curtains closed, they entered a space that was dark, enclosed, and separate from the rest of the world. Inside the curtains, by the faint glow of a single candle, if any light at all, they were alone with their thoughts, their prayers, and their fears. The great bed, for all its comfort and protection, was also a kind of cage. Safe, yes, but isolating. Cut off from help if anything went wrong, dependent on the curtains, the canopy, the herbs, and the prayers to keep them safe through the long night ahead. Dressing for sleep. Layers of protection. What a medieval noble wore to bed was as ritualized and significant as everything else about their nighttime routine. These weren't pajamas in the modern sense. They were carefully designed garments that served multiple purposes: warmth, modesty, and spiritual protection. For men, the basic garment was a long shirt or chemise made from linen. This wasn't a t-shirt. It was a long tunic-like garment that reached at least to the knees and often to the ankles. The linen was chosen for specific reasons. It was smooth against the skin, unlike wool which could irritate during sleep. It was relatively easy to wash, important given medieval understanding of cleanliness. And it was thought to allow the skin to breathe, preventing the buildup of harmful vapors during sleep. Over this linen shift, men might wear a nightgown or bedrobe, particularly in winter. This was made of wool, providing crucial warmth in cold chambers. Some bedrobes were quilted, containing a layer of wool batting between two layers of fabric, creating an early form of insulated sleepwear. The wealthy might have bedrobes lined with fur, particularly at the collar and cuffs where cold air might enter. For women, the foundation garment was similar, a long linen shift or smock. But women's sleepwear included additional considerations. Modesty was paramount. Even in the privacy of their chambers, with only their husbands present, noble women were expected to be properly covered. The shift was designed to cover from neck to ankles, with long sleeves that reached the wrists. Over the shift, women wore a nightgown, similar to men's bedrobes but often more elaborate. These might be embroidered at the neck and cuffs, showing status even in sleep. Wealthier women had nightgowns in different weights for different seasons. Summer nightgowns might be lighter wool or even linen. Winter nightgowns were heavy wool, often lined with additional fabric or fur. Both men and women wore nightcaps. These weren't optional fashion accessories. They were essential protection against the cold. The head was considered particularly vulnerable during sleep. Medieval medical theory held that vapors rose from the body during sleep, and these needed to be controlled. A nightcap kept the head warm and supposedly contained these vapors properly. Nightcaps came in various styles, but most were simple caps that covered the head completely, sometimes with ties under the chin to keep them in place. Women's nightcaps often completely enclosed the hair, which was considered important for both warmth and spiritual protection. Loose hair at night was associated with witchcraft and immorality in some medieval beliefs. Socks or bed shoes were common, especially in winter. Bare feet on cold stone floors was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. Chilled feet could lead to chills through the whole body, inviting illness. So thick wool socks or soft leather slippers were worn to bed. Some nobles had special bed shoes, soft shoes designed only for sleeping, kept by the bed and never worn elsewhere. The color of sleepwear mattered to some. White or natural linen colors were most common and considered pure. But some nobles had colored nightwear, and the colors carried meaning. Red was thought to invigorate, possibly too much for sleep, but some wore it believing it protected against illness. Blue was calming. Green was avoided by some, associated with the fairy world and considered unlucky. But beyond the practical aspects of warmth and comfort, sleepwear had spiritual significance. Many garments had protective symbols sewn into them. Small crosses might be embroidered at the neck or cuffs. Some nightgowns had prayers worked into the hem in tiny stitching. These weren't decorative. They were protective spells, religious armor against the dangers of night. Some nobles wore small reliquaries to bed, tiny containers holding fragments of saints' bones or scraps of cloth from holy sites. These were worn on chains around the neck, pressed against the skin. The proximity to the body during sleep was thought to provide maximum protection. Jewelry for sleep was limited, but significant. Rings might be worn, particularly those with religious inscriptions or containing small relics. These were believed to ward off nightmares and demonic visitation. Some nobles wore small amulets, objects blessed by priests or containing protective substances like holy water or consecrated salt. Changing into sleepwear was itself a ritual. The daytime clothing was removed piece by piece, not carelessly tossed aside, but carefully folded or hung. Servants might assist with this process, unlacing complicated garments, removing multiple layers. But even nobles who dressed themselves followed a pattern. Right arm out of the sleeve first, left sock removed before right. These small rituals created a rhythm, a transition from the day's activities to the night's rest. The nightwear was put on in a specific order. Shift first, pulled over the head and smoothed down. Then the nightgown or bedrobe. The belt or tie at the waist, secured firmly. The nightcap last, carefully positioned. Each step was deliberate, almost meditative. Rushing through dressing for bed was considered unwise. It jarred the spirit, unsettled the humors, led to poor sleep. Women had an additional consideration: their hair. Daytime hairstyles, often elaborate and involving pins, braids, and coverings, were carefully undone. But the hair wasn't simply let loose. It was braided for sleep, often in one long braid down the back. This served practical purposes, preventing tangling and making it easier to cover completely with the nightcap. But it also had spiritual significance. Loose hair was associated with wild, uncontrolled femininity. Braided hair represented order, control, safety. For women of the highest nobility, There were additional beauty rituals mixed with the spiritual preparation. The face might be washed with special preparations, often milk-based, designed to maintain pale skin. Pale skin was a mark of nobility. Women who worked outdoors became tanned, so pale skin proved you didn't have to labor in the fields. Some women applied night masks, pastes made from various substances that were left on during sleep. These might contain ingredients we'd find bizarre today. White lead for whitening, mixed with fats or oils. These preparations were actually toxic, slowly poisoning the women who used them. But the pressure to maintain appropriate noble beauty was intense, and many accepted the discomfort and danger. Men, too, had grooming rituals before bed. Beards, if worn, were combed and sometimes oiled. Hands were washed carefully. Teeth, such as they were, might be cleaned with a cloth or a simple stick frayed at one end. Oral hygiene was primitive, but some attempt was usually made to clean the mouth before sleep. The clothing worn during the day was checked before being stored for the night. Any tears or damage needed to be noted for repair. Any stains needed immediate attention. But more importantly, the clothing was inspected for any signs of tampering. Poison could be introduced through clothing. Powders worked into the fabric could cause rashes or worse. This wasn't paranoia. It was documented reality. Once fully dressed for sleep, the noble moved to the bed. But they didn't simply climb in. There were final preparations. They knelt, usually at the bedside, for evening prayers. These prayers were longer and more involved than a simple God bless. They included specific petitions for protection through the night, for the safety of the household, for the health of family members. Some nobles had prayer books specifically for bedtime use, small volumes containing the appropriate prayers and psalms. These might be read aloud or silently by the individual or by the household chaplain if one was present. The prayers covered every fear: protection from fire, from thieves, from illness, from bad dreams, from demonic attack, from sudden death. Only after prayers were complete did the noble finally enter the bed. The bed curtains were still open at this point. The final candle burned. The noble climbed carefully into the bed, settling into the mattress, arranging pillows, pulling up the heavy coverlet. Then, and only then, were the bed curtains drawn closed, shutting out the world, creating that small enclosed space that would be home for the next several hours. In this enclosed darkness, wrapped in layers of linen and wool, head covered by the nightcap, body positioned just so on the pillows, the noble tried to sleep. But sleep, in the medieval understanding, wasn't the relaxed unconsciousness we seek today. It was a dangerous passage, a journey through darkness, both literal and spiritual. And everything they wore, every garment, every amulet, every prayer, was armor for that journey. Spiritual protection, the elaborate rituals, the physical preparations for sleep, elaborate as they were, paled in comparison to the spiritual protections medieval nobles employed. The night wasn't just dark and cold. It was, in the medieval worldview, actively dangerous. Evil spirits, demons, and even the devil himself were thought to be more powerful and active at night when good Christians were vulnerable in sleep. The evening prayers we mentioned were just the beginning. The bedtime ritual for a devout noble, and most were devout at least publicly, was extensive and complex. It started well before entering the bedchamber, often beginning at the evening meal with specific prayers designed to prepare the soul for the coming night. The household chaplain, if present, played a central role. In wealthy households, the chaplain might bless each family member individually before they retired. This blessing involved making the sign of the cross, sprinkling holy water, and speaking prayers of protection. The holy water was believed to create a barrier that evil forces couldn't cross. Some nobles had holy water sprinkled not just on themselves, but around their bedchamber, particularly at the threshold and near windows. Salt, that humble household substance, took on enormous spiritual significance at bedtime. Blessed salt might be sprinkled across the threshold of the bedchamber, creating a protective barrier. Some nobles placed small dishes of salt at the four corners of their bed. Salt was associated with incorruptibility, with preservation, with purity. It represented the opposite of decay and evil. The bed itself became a kind of altar. We've mentioned the sachets placed at the corners, but these were often supplemented with other protective objects. Small reliquaries containing fragments of saints' bones were common. These weren't large, ornate objects. They were tiny, sometimes no bigger than a thumbnail, sewn into the mattress or the canopy itself. Crosses were positioned strategically. One might hang above the bed, suspended from the canopy frame. Others might be sewn into the bed curtains. Some nobles had crosses carved into the wooden bed frame itself. The cross was the ultimate Christian protection, the symbol of Christ's victory over death and evil. But Christianity, as practiced by medieval nobles, wasn't always as pure and simple as the church might have preferred. Older beliefs, pagan remnants, and folk magic all mixed together into the practices actually used. Iron, for example, had protective properties that predated Christianity. Iron was believed to repel fairy folk and certain types of evil spirits. Some nobles placed iron objects under their beds or mattresses. This might be a simple iron bar, or it might be something more specific like an iron knife or horseshoe. Herbs had both practical and spiritual uses. We've mentioned lavender, rosemary, and chamomile in the sachets, but the specific combinations mattered. Some herb mixtures were thought to protect against nightmares specifically, others against demonic visitation, still others against the evil eye, a belief that someone's malevolent gaze could cause harm even from a distance. Rue was a particularly powerful herb in medieval belief. It was associated with protection against witchcraft and the devil. Some nobles had rue growing in pots in their chambers, or had dried rue hung above their beds. The smell was pungent, not particularly pleasant, but that was almost part of its power. Evil was repelled by certain scents. Garlic, today associated with vampire protection, thanks to later folklore, was indeed used in medieval times, but more for general protection and health. A string of garlic might hang in a chamber, or individual cloves might be tucked into the bedding. The strong smell was thought to ward off illness as well as evil influences. Before climbing into bed, many nobles performed a specific ritual. They would stand at the bedside and make the sign of the cross 3 times. 3 for the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The sign would be made in the air before them, then on their own body, touching forehead, chest, left shoulder, right shoulder. Then a spoken prayer, perhaps the Paternoster, Our Father, or Ave Maria, Hail Mary. Fundamental prayers every Christian knew. Some nobles went further. They might prostrate themselves, lying flat on the floor beside the bed in an attitude of complete submission to God, praying for protection through the night. This was particularly common during times of crisis or illness, when the danger felt more immediate. Confession before sleep was considered wise, though not always practical. The ideal was to enter sleep with a clear conscience, all sins confessed and absolved. But the household chaplain couldn't be everywhere at once. So many nobles performed self-examination, mentally reviewing their day, acknowledging their sins to God directly, asking for forgiveness. Children had their own protective rituals, taught from infancy. They were taught to cross themselves before sleep, to say simple prayers, and to keep their hands outside the covers in a prayer position as they fell asleep. The hands together position was thought to be protective, keeping the hands in a holy posture that evil couldn't penetrate. A particularly interesting practice was the blessing of the threshold. The doorway to the bedchamber was a liminal space, a boundary between public and private, between protected and vulnerable. Before closing the door for the night, some nobles had the threshold itself blessed. This might involve sprinkling it with holy water, marking it with a cross in oil or ash, or placing protective objects across it. Once the door was closed and bolted, some nobles placed additional objects against it from the inside. A broom laid across the threshold was thought to prevent witches from entering, based on the belief that a witch couldn't cross over a broom. A knife placed under the doormat, blade pointing outward, was thought to cut any evil influences trying to enter. The windows, even when shuttered, were protected. A cross might be scratched or painted on the shutter. Salt might be sprinkled on the windowsill. Some nobles placed small religious images or paintings near windows, believing that evil spirits would be repelled by the holy images. Mirrors, if the chamber contained any, were covered at night. This practice had multiple justifications. Mirrors were thought to be potential gateways for spirits to enter or exit. They might trap the soul during sleep, preventing it from returning to the body. And simply, an uncovered mirror in a dark room might reflect candlelight or moonlight in unsettling ways, disturbing sleep. The practice of the first sleep and second sleep, that biphasic sleep pattern we mentioned earlier, had a spiritual component. The period of wakefulness between the two sleep periods was considered particularly appropriate for prayer and meditation. The night was divided into watches, originally based on Roman military practice, but adopted by the church. During this midnight waking period, many nobles would pray. These weren't the structured prayers of morning or evening, but more personal, intimate communications with God. This quiet, dark hour was seen as a time when the barrier between the earthly and heavenly realms was thin, when prayers might be more readily heard. Some took this further, believing that God spoke to people during the night, either through dreams or during this waking period. So they would lie quietly, listening, waiting, hoping for divine guidance or comfort. This practice reinforced the idea that sleep wasn't just unconsciousness, but a spiritually significant state. Dreams themselves were taken very seriously. They were believed to be messages, either from God, from evil spirits trying to deceive, or from natural causes related to the body's humors. Interpreting dreams was a skill, and some nobles kept dream records, writing down significant dreams immediately upon waking to help remember and interpret them later. Nightmares, which we understand as bad dreams, were believed to be actual demonic attacks. The word itself comes from night and mare, an old word for a demon or evil spirit that sat on the chest of sleepers, causing bad dreams and a feeling of suffocating. Protection against nightmares was serious business. The sachets of herbs, the prayers, the religious symbols, all these were as much about preventing nightmares as about physical protection. If despite all protections, a nightmare did occur, there were specific responses. Upon waking from a nightmare, the noble was supposed to immediately make the sign of the cross and say a prayer. Then to recount the dream to someone trustworthy, ideally the chaplain, to help interpret it and determine if it carried a message or warning. Some nightmares were believed to be prophetic, warnings from God about future events. Others were seen as temptations from the devil, trying to lead the dreamer into sin. Still others were simply the result of eating the wrong foods or having an imbalanced humor. Determining which was which required wisdom and often clerical advice. The ultimate protection, the bedrock beneath all these rituals, was faith itself. A sincere faith in God's protection, in the power of Christ and the saints, was believed to be the strongest defense against evil. All the herbs, salt, iron, and holy water were helps, but faith was the true shield. And yet, despite this emphasis on faith, the sheer number and variety of protective practices suggests deep anxiety. Medieval nobles, for all their power and wealth, felt vulnerable at night. The darkness was not just absence of light, but presence of threat. Sleep was not rest, but risk. And so they built layer upon layer of protection, physical and spiritual, hoping that somewhere in all these rituals lay true safety. As they finally settled into bed, curtains drawn in the enclosed darkness, they were surrounded by their protections, but also by their fears. The bed was a fortress, but it was also an island in a sea of darkness. And every creak of the castle, every whisper of wind, every shadow cast by the dying fire could be something more, something watching, something waiting, something that all the prayers and herbs and holy water might not be enough to keep at bay. The two-sleep pattern, a divided night, One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval sleep that seems almost alien to us today was the practice of divided or biphasic sleep. Medieval people, including nobles in their castles, didn't sleep in one continuous 8-hour block as we try to do. Instead, they slept in two distinct periods with a wakeful interval in between. This wasn't insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was the normal, expected pattern. People would retire to bed shortly after sunset, perhaps around 8 or 9 in the evening, depending on the season. They would then sleep for several hours in what was called the first sleep. This period of sleep was recognized and named. In England, it was first sleep. In France, premier sommeil. In Italy, primo sonno. The consistency of the terminology across cultures tells us this was widespread and understood. The first sleep would last perhaps 3 or 4 hours, taking them to around midnight or 1 in the morning. Then, they would wake naturally, not gradually, fighting to stay awake, but genuinely, fully awake. This waking period was expected, even anticipated. It wasn't considered a problem to be fixed, but a natural part of the night's rhythm. What did people do during this wakeful interval? The activities varied, but they were remarkably diverse. Some people prayed. This midnight or early morning hour was considered spiritually significant, a quiet time when prayers might be especially powerful. The monastic communities had formalized this, with bells calling monks to prayer in the middle of the night. Lay nobles often followed a similar practice, though without the bells. Some engaged in intimate activities with their spouses. The wakeful interval was considered an appropriate time for marital relations. Some medieval medical texts suggested that conception was more likely to occur during this time, though the reasoning was based on humoral theory rather than any actual understanding of fertility. Others used the time for quiet contemplation or conversation. In the darkness of the bedchamber, with the curtains still drawn and the world outside quiet, couples might talk. These conversations, whispered in the dark, were opportunities to discuss matters too private or delicate for daytime discussion. Family concerns, worries about children, fears about health or finances. All these might surface during this intimate, isolated hour. Some people use the wakeful interval for practical activities. They might get up, tend the fire if it had burned low, check on children, visit the chamber pot. Some might eat a light snack, particularly in winter when the long cold nights made some sustenance welcome. Simple foods like bread, cheese, perhaps a cup of weak ale or wine were common. Reading, for those who could read and had access to books, was another activity, but this wasn't easy. Lighting candles used up expensive wax or tallow, but some nobles, particularly scholarly ones, did read during this time. Religious texts were most common: psalms, prayers, lives of saints. The quiet darkness was seen as conducive to spiritual reading and meditation. Some people simply lay quietly, thinking, remembering, planning. This was a time for mental work, for problem solving, for reflection. The darkness and silence created a space very different from the busy, public world of the daylight hours. Solutions to problems might emerge during this quiet time. The wakeful interval typically lasted 1 to 2 hours. Then, almost as naturally as they had awakened, people would feel sleepiness return. They would settle back into their beds, arrange their pillows and covers, and drift into the second sleep. This second period of sleep would last until dawn, when the morning bells or the sounds of the waking household would rouse them for the day. Interestingly, this biphasic sleep pattern seems to have been linked to natural light exposure. In a world without artificial lighting, people were exposed to much more darkness than we are today. The medieval night was truly dark, and this darkness affected the body's natural rhythms in ways that our electrically lit world doesn't. Research by historians like Roger Eckerch, who extensively studied historical references to sleep, found hundreds of mentions of first and second sleep in medieval and early modern documents. Court depositions, medical texts, literature, prayer manuals, all casually mention these sleep periods, as though everyone understood what they meant. For nobles in their castles, the wakeful interval had particular significance. The castle at night was a dangerous place. Guards might grow drowsy. Intruders might attempt entry. Household members with ill intentions might move through the darkened corridors. Being naturally awake in the middle of the night allowed for informal security checks. Some lords would get up during the wakeful interval and walk through parts of the castle, ostensibly to use the garderobe or tend to some matter, but actually checking that all was secure. This wasn't paranoia but prudent vigilance. The night watch, the guards posted through the night, expected these midnight movements and knew to recognize the lord or lady. For women, particularly those pregnant or nursing, the wakeful interval was often spent attending to children. A child might be checked, a baby nursed. The crying of a child in the night was a common cause of waking, and the biphasic sleep pattern meant that waking to tend a child fit naturally into the sleep rhythm rather than disrupting it. The transition back to sleep after the wakeful interval was aided by various practices. Some people recited specific prayers designed to invite sleep. Others used breathing techniques, deliberately slowing their breath. Some focused on pleasant, calming thoughts. The goal was to relax back into sleep naturally, without anxiety or effort. Weather could affect the wakeful interval. On stormy nights, the sound of wind and rain might keep people awake longer. On very cold nights, the discomfort of leaving the warm bed meant people might shorten their wakeful time, staying beneath the covers and dozing rather than fully waking. The seasons affected sleep patterns too. Winter nights were longer, and people might sleep more, extending both the first and second sleep periods. Summer nights were shorter, and sleep was accordingly compressed. But the basic pattern of 2 sleeps with a wakeful interval remained consistent. This sleep pattern began to disappear with the advent of better artificial lighting and later with the industrial revolution's demand for different work schedules. By the late 17th and into the 18th century, references to first and second sleep become less common, replaced by the idea of one continuous sleep period that we consider normal today. But for medieval nobles in their castles, the 2-sleep pattern was as natural as breathing. It structured the night, created rhythm and expectation. The first sleep was for initial rest, for letting go of the day. The wakeful interval was for the mind, for the spirit, for intimate connection or quiet reflection. The second sleep was for deep rest, for healing, for dreams. The dreams that came in second sleep were often considered more significant than those in first sleep. The mind, having had its wakeful period to process thoughts and concerns, could in second sleep access deeper truths. Prophetic dreams, visitations from deceased loved ones, divine messages, these were thought to come more often in second sleep. Some nobles kept writing materials by their bedside specifically to record dreams from second sleep. A small tablet of wax that could be written on with a stylus, or perhaps paper and ink if they were wealthy enough and trusted their ability to write in near darkness. These dream records were taken to chaplains or other advisors for interpretation. The practice of divided sleep also affected how people thought about time itself. The night wasn't a blank period of unconsciousness, but had structure and meaning. Midnight wasn't just a clock point, but a real experience, the time of waking, of transition from first to second sleep. Church bells often rang at midnight, acknowledging this wakeful time. These midnight bells called monks to prayer, but also served as a reminder to lay people that this was a holy hour, a time for spiritual attention, even if one wasn't in a monastery. For the ill or dying, the wakeful interval could be particularly significant. Those caring for sick family members would often be awake during this time, tending to them. Deathbed vigils naturally aligned with the biphasic sleep pattern, with watchers alert during the interval when the sick person might also be awake and lucid. The elderly, who often sleep less soundly, might have longer wakeful intervals. This was accepted and accommodated. An older noble might spend 2 hours awake, praying, thinking, remembering their life. This wasn't insomnia to be cured, but the natural rhythm of aging. Children were an exception to the 2-sleep pattern. They were encouraged to sleep through the night without waking. The developing body and mind needed continuous rest. It was believed parents would take care not to disturb sleeping children during their own wakeful interval. As modern research into sleep has advanced, scientists have found evidence that biphasic sleep might actually be closer to our natural rhythm than the 8-hour block we've adopted. Some sleep researchers suggest that our struggles with insomnia might be partly caused by fighting against our body's desire for this more natural, divided pattern. For medieval nobles, lying in their curtained beds during that wakeful interval, the experience was both solitary and connected. Solitary because they were in darkness, alone with their thoughts or quietly conversing in whispers. Connected because they knew that throughout the castle, throughout the kingdom, others were experiencing the same wakeful time. The shared rhythm created a strange kind of community. Everyone awake together in the middle of the night. This was the landscape of medieval sleep. Not a simple drift into unconsciousness, but a journey with stages, with meaning, with purpose. The first sleep, the waking, the second sleep. Each part distinct, each part important, each part protected by all those rituals and prayers and herbs and holy water. Because the night was long and full of mystery, and sleep was not escape, but passage through darkness toward morning light. Morning. The rituals of waking, the process of waking in a medieval castle was as ritualized as the process of sleeping. Dawn didn't arrive with an alarm clock, but with a gradual increase in natural light and the slow stirring of the household coming back to life. The first sounds were often from the chapel. Morning bells called the faithful to lauds. The dawn prayer. These bells served as a kind of alarm for the entire castle. The chapel might be separate from the main sleeping quarters, but the bells were designed to carry, to penetrate even thick stone walls and heavy bed curtains. For those sleeping in the main chambers, the first indication that morning approached might be the sound of servants beginning their work. Fires needed to be rekindled. Water needed to be fetched. The daily work of the castle started before most nobles were awake. Inside the curtained bed, the noble would wake gradually. The transition from second sleep to wakefulness was expected to be gentle, not jarring. Waking too suddenly was thought to be harmful, potentially trapping the soul partway between the dream world and waking world. The first conscious act was often a prayer. Before even opening the bed curtains, many nobles would lie still and recite a morning prayer, thanking God for protection through the night, for the gift of a new day. This prayer was different from the elaborate evening prayers. It was simpler, more spontaneous, a genuine expression of gratitude for having survived the night. Then the bed curtains would be opened, usually from the outside by a servant who had been waiting for signs of stirring from within. In wealthy households, the same servant who had prepared the chamber the night before would be there to assist with waking. This servant would have already checked that the fire was rekindled, that the chamber was warming, that everything was ready. The morning cold was often brutal. Even with a fire going, the stone walls radiated chill. The noble might sit up in bed, pulling the coverlet around their shoulders for warmth, reluctant to leave the relative warmth of the bedding for the cold air of the chamber. Clothing that had been removed the night before was checked by servants before being returned to the noble. This wasn't just about cleanliness, but about safety. Overnight, someone could have tampered with the garments. Poison could have been introduced. Vermin could have nested in folds of fabric. The servant would shake out each item, check for any problems, and only then help the noble dress. But first came the morning ablutions. A basin of water, usually cold because heating water took time and fuel, was provided for washing. The noble would wash hands and face, a ritual cleansing that was both practical and symbolic. The night's sleep was washed away. The new day begun clean. Some nobles used special preparations for this morning wash. Rose water for the face was common among wealthy women. Men might use water scented with herbs, but for most, plain water was the standard, perhaps with a bit of soap if the household made or could afford it. Teeth were attended to with varying degrees of care. Some used claws to rub their teeth. Others had sticks frayed at one end to create a primitive brush. Herbal preparations, often involving salt, might be used to scrub the teeth and supposedly freshen the breath. But dental hygiene, as we understand, it was minimal. Tooth decay was common, and tooth loss was accepted as inevitable. The chamber pot, if it had been used during the night, was discreetly removed by a servant. This was one of the least desirable tasks, but it was necessary. The contents would be taken to the guardrabes, or in some cases, collected for use in certain industrial processes. Urine, for example, was used in textile production for setting dyes. Dressing for the day was a process, especially for women. The layers of clothing, the lacing, the arrangement of veils and head coverings all required assistance. Men's clothing was simpler, but still involved multiple layers. The order of dressing followed customs, specific garments put on in specific sequences. Hair was attended to. Men might comb their hair and beards if worn. Women's hair, which had been braided for sleep, was unbraided, combed, and then arranged according to the day's requirements. Married women typically kept their hair covered during the day, so elaborate hairstyling might involve pinning and wrapping before the final head covering was applied. The bed itself was immediately attended to by servants. Mattresses were lifted and shaken to redistribute the filling. Sheets were removed for washing or airing. The ropes supporting the mattress were checked and tightened if necessary. The chamber was quickly transformed from sleeping space to daytime room, with the bed remade and the chamber prepared for any daytime activities that might occur there. The morning meal, if there was one, was light. Many medieval people didn't eat a substantial breakfast. Bread, perhaps some cheese, maybe watered wine or ale. The first real meal of the day came later, often not until midday. But nobles might break their fast with something small to ease the transition from sleep to activity. Morning prayers were more extensive than the initial waking prayer. If the household had a chaplain, there might be a morning service. If not, nobles would recite their own prayers, often using prayer books or reciting from memory. These prayers included thanks for the new day, petitions for guidance and protection, and intercessions for family members and the kingdom. The morning was also time for checking the household. The lady of the castle, in particular, would often use the morning hours to speak with the steward about household matters, to check on food supplies, to make decisions about the day's activities. The lord might meet with his advisors, review messages that had arrived, plan for any business that needed attention. For children, morning meant lessons. Tutors would arrive to instruct noble children in reading, writing, religion, and other appropriate subjects. Young nobles were expected to use their mornings productively, and sleep was not allowed to extend too late into the day. The morning light, that gradual increase in brightness, was welcomed after the long night. Windows were unshuttered, allowing light and fresh air into chambers that had been sealed for hours. The contrast between the closed, protected night and the open, active day was stark and intentional. The protective objects that had been positioned around the chamber at night might be collected and stored. The sachets might be refreshed or replaced. Any candles that had burned through the night would be collected, the remaining wax saved for reuse. Nothing was wasted. In winter, mornings were particularly harsh. The night's cold had penetrated deep into the stone, and even with fires burning, the chill persisted. Nobles might delay leaving their chambers, conducting morning business from bed if possible, only fully rising when the day had warmed somewhat. In summer, the opposite was true. The morning was the most pleasant time, before the heat of the day built up in the stone rooms. Summer mornings might see nobles rising earlier, eager to enjoy the relative cool. The transition from night to day, from sleep to waking, was seen as a vulnerable time spiritually as well as physically. The morning prayers and rituals were partly about protection during this transition, ensuring that the soul, which had been wandering in dreams, was fully returned and integrated into the waking body. Dreams remembered from the night might be discussed with confessors or advisors. Particularly vivid or disturbing dreams required interpretation. Were they divine messages? Demonic temptations? Results of indigestion? The meaning mattered because it might affect decisions made that day. The household slowly came to full life. The sounds increased as the morning progressed. Servants hurried through corridors. Animals were tended. Breakfast preparations, such as they were completed. The castle transformed from the closed, suspicious fortress of night into the bustling center of the estate's activity. And through it all, the noble family moved from the private, protected space of their chambers into the public, active space of their duties. The layers of nighttime protection were removed. The spiritual defenses stood down. The bed curtains were drawn back and tied. The shutters were opened wide. The night and all its dangers receded, at least until sunset began the cycle again. Conclusion: sleep as survival. As we come to the end of our journey through a medieval noble's night, what becomes clear is that sleep in a medieval castle was never simple rest. It was a complex ritual, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to navigate dangers both real and imagined. Every aspect of the bedtime routine, from the food eaten at the evening meal to the position of sachets around the bed, from the prayers recited to the way the bed curtains were drawn, all of it served a purpose. These weren't empty superstitions or meaningless traditions. They were the tools by which medieval people managed their very real fears and their very real vulnerabilities. The cold was real. Those massive stone castles were brutally cold in winter. The elaborate bed construction, the warming pans, the layers of clothing and bedding, these were genuine necessities for physical survival. The danger from family members and household staff was real. Inheritance disputes did lead to violence. Servants did sometimes betray their masters. The locks, the guards, the careful checking of food and clothing, these weren't paranoia, but prudent precautions. The health threats were real. Without modern medicine, a small illness could quickly become fatal. The herbs, the attention to diet, the concern about proper sleep position and environment, these were the only tools available to maintain health. What we might label as superstition, the belief in evil spirits and demonic attack, was their way of understanding and managing psychological realities. Nightmares, sleep paralysis, the anxiety of vulnerability during sleep, these experiences are universal. Medieval people interpreted them through the lens of their religious and cultural beliefs. The elaborate rituals served a psychological purpose too. They created a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. By following the proper procedures, by saying the right prayers, by positioning the protective objects correctly, nobles could feel they were doing everything possible to ensure their safety. The community aspect shouldn't be overlooked either. Everyone in the castle, from the lord to the lowest servant, participated in these nightly rituals. The evening bells rang for everyone. The prayers were said by all. The transition from day to night was a shared experience that reinforced social bonds, even as it separated people into their individual chambers. Modern sleep, by comparison, seems almost careless. We flip a switch, eliminating darkness instantly. We adjust a thermostat, controlling temperature precisely. We lock a door with a key and assume security. We lie down, expecting to fall unconscious for 8 hours and wake refreshed. We've stripped away almost all the ritual, almost all the ceremony, and yet we struggle with sleep. Insomnia, sleep anxiety, racing thoughts, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. These are epidemic in modern society. Perhaps the medieval approach, for all its apparent superstition and complexity, contains some wisdom we've lost. The deliberate transition from activity to rest. The spiritual preparation through prayer and meditation. The physical preparation of the sleeping space. The acceptance of biphasic sleep with its wakeful interval for quiet reflection. The understanding that sleep is important, even sacred, deserving of care and attention. We don't need to adopt medieval superstitions to benefit from medieval wisdom about sleep, but we might do well to bring more intentionality to our bedtime routines, to create genuine transitions from day to night, to prepare our sleeping spaces with care, to release the day's worries through some form of meditation or prayer or journaling before sleep. The medieval noble's bedtime, bizarre as it seems to modern eyes, was fundamentally about respect. Respect for the power of darkness. Respect for the vulnerability of sleep. Respect for the spiritual dimensions of human experience. And respect for the body's need for proper rest and protection. As you prepare for sleep tonight, in your temperature-controlled room, in your comfortable bed, with electric lights to banish darkness at will, perhaps spare a thought for those medieval nobles, wrapped in wool and linen, surrounded by herbs and prayers, lying in the darkness behind heavy curtains, hoping that all their preparations would be enough to carry them safely through the night. They survived. Generation after generation made it through those long, cold, fearful nights. They woke to new days, managed their estates, raised their children, lived their lives. The rituals worked, not because the herbs really repelled demons or the prayers actually summoned divine protection, but because the rituals created structure, provided comfort, and affirmed that sleep, the most vulnerable of human states, was worthy of serious attention and care. So let yourself drift now. Let the details of medieval bedtime fade into the background. Let the image of those curtained beds, those glowing fires, those whispered prayers become soft and dreamlike. You don't need sachets of herbs or prayers for protection. Your world is safer, warmer, more controlled. But perhaps, as you settle into sleep, you can appreciate what you have. The simple security of a safe space, the comfort of warmth, the luxury of peace. And perhaps, just perhaps, you can bring a small measure of medieval intentionality to your own sleep. Not the fear, but the respect. Not the superstition, but the care. Sleep well, sleep tight. And tomorrow, when you wake, may the morning light find you rested and grateful, just as those medieval nobles hoped when they finally closed the bed curtains and surrendered to the mysterious journey of sleep.